Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I like to discuss what Brexit was supposed to deliver, or it actually delivered, and what people think about it according to the latest polling. But first, for daily political commentary, please hit the subscribe button so you stay notified. So I must start off. Little question Steve Bray had for Reform UK's Richard Tice. They were out and about in London, as they are. What are the benefits of Brexit, he asked. Trump, said Tice. Then, realising that he'd been asked for benefits, plural, said Trump again in the hopes that that qualifies. 5 years after leaving the EU, wasn't it supposed to be Remainers who would be clutching at straws by now? That's the best they can come up with. The man who stands every chance of kicking our economy once Brexit has already knocked it down. That's it, is it? I'm not sure Tice's idea of a benefit is necessarily the same most people would recognise. It's also not clear how Brexit created Trump. Does Tice think America looked at the UK, saw us doing something crazy which wrecked our society, politics and economy, and thought, that looks like fun, we'll do the same. But anyway, there's been a couple of good bits of work commemorating the 5th anniversary of shooting ourselves in the foot. YouGov carried out some polling, worth looking at. BBC Verified did a decent rundown of some of the key features of Brexit. So let's go over some of what the BBC came up with and add my own thoughts to it. First of all, it's clear that trade has been negatively impacted. As the BBC points out, it's hard to say exactly how much because there are different ways of measuring the parallel universe where we did not leave based on modelling similar economies. But it is negative. How could it not be negative? We're asking people to go slower across the trade border, sometimes waiting in a lorry park for like a whole day, going nowhere, and needing lots of paperwork, lots of expenses, fees, sometimes tariffs, sometimes some things you can't trade at all now. But if you look at the chart in the article, so you can see service exports have still increased, goods exports have decreased. But did service exports increase because of Brexit or in spite of it? Because we'd have expected that to grow anyway. People generally expect their economy to grow. Because the hard Brexit is mostly a problem for goods. Importing and exporting goods faces physical choke points at the trade border. Lots of paperwork needed. Fees can apply. We don't have that many people that are good at doing the paperwork or checking it. So services have been negatively impacted as well, but it's not straightforward. For example, to travel between the EU and Britain to deliver services in person. But the bulk of our international service industry is able to function just fine. There's also nothing in our Brexit deals with either the EU or other countries which significantly improves our ability to sell services. In fact, in one handy little table in the article is the economic assessment of every single Brexit, post-Brexit trade deal, including two which don't even exist but the Conservatives were chasing. All of our post-Brexit trade deals, including the imaginary ones, boost our GDP by basically zero. In order to get a non-zero number, you need to sort of have decimal points. And even then, it's still basically zero. And those figures tend to be after 20 or 30 years. If you read the reports, which I have, and I've done videos at the time. The impact of leaving the single market and customs union was immediate and is considered to be a net loss to GDP of 4%. So basically, the fact that our trade in services grew had nothing to do with Brexit. It was going to grow anyway. It had grown before Brexit. But it's also not enough to make up for the loss of trade in goods either. See, our balance of trade is still negative. Needless to say, it would not have been had we not left the EU, because it's actually very close to not being negative, actually. So we could have had a little period of decent growth, ironically. Then there's immigration. Let's just leave this here, shall we? Now, I said before, I absolutely appreciate that people can't understand how ending a freedom of movement actually boosts immigration. It's counterintuitive. I appreciate that. Doesn't make sense. But that's because there are a couple of things that the public are generally misunderstanding, and they're given that misunderstanding deliberately by the public, by the press rather. The main one is that freedom of movement is not actually as free as some people think. Just like a free trade agreement does not give you free trade. It's just the name. Only being part of the same market can give you really free trade, like we used to have. There were always restrictions on movement in terms of other EU citizens living in the UK. In fact, the UK government's own rules were looser than the EU's rules because you're allowed to loosen your rules. Some of the issues Leave voters had about EU migration were actually down to UK laws. When I talked to them, it says, oh, we don't like this thing. It says, that's not an EU law. We do that. Our government could choose not to do that. Big one, for example, being able to pay a migrant worker less than the going rate under certain circumstances. That's not an EU rule. Many other EU countries don't allow it. It was a UK rule, one which is still in place, by the way. Oh, and since Brexit, Boris Johnson actually made the situation even worse. It's now even easier to hire cheaper migrant labour. And as for the overall immigration figures, well, the results speak for themselves. Whether people understand why this happened or not, this is what happened. And yes, it is down to Brexit, because it's now harder to get migrant workers from Europe. So we had to attract loads more from further afield. But when you get workers from a long way, like thousands of miles away, that's a big move for them. You don't just pop over. You're moving here. So they're likely to bring their family, of course, which is what has boosted those record high figures to an extent. As much as it might seem weird, reintroducing freedom of movement for EU citizens would reduce immigration. The BBC also talks about travel. Obviously, there is not just friction on getting goods into and out of the country, but people as well. Long queues for passport checks. The new entry systems still aren't in place yet. There's more fun and games to come, don't you worry. You're only allowed to spend 90 days out of every 180 in the EU now. You may not think that's a big problem. You're just going on holiday for a couple of weeks. But some have been turned away at the border. Why? Because it's no longer enough just to have a valid passport. You need one that's got several months left on it now. Some people who were not aware of this had holidays knackered because of it. And as for people who need to travel to the EU regularly for business, there are no exceptions to the 90-day rule just because you're not on our holidays. Unless, of course, you happen to have an EU passport as well. So EU citizens with settlement rights in the UK will be better for those sorts of jobs. So well done, Tories. You just gave a competitive advantage to migrants in Britain in our service sector over UK citizens. It's better to hire someone with an EU passport if you might ever want them to travel to Europe. Nice one. BBC did also talk about issues around laws and monies as well, but the general public don't tend to pay much attention to those because, you know, how many people really do follow new laws and finer details of government expenditure. Needless to say that having divergent rules on standards means there are more checks needed on our goods, which slows the system down and increases prices. Indeed, Labour's plan is to reverse that, to align those standards so that we need fewer checks. So that's what you need to do to ease trade. You have to align pretty much all standards which affect our trade with the EU. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to adopt rules that EU members have decided. That used to be us, not anymore. So the truth of Brexit was that we actually went from a rule maker to a rule taker. The Brexiteers got it backwards, just like they did on everything else. Finally, a bit of polling. YouGov were asking people for their views for the 5th anniversary. 30% still think it was the right move. Really far too high, isn't it? But significantly below the 55% who think we were wrong to leave. Unsurprisingly, the vast majority of Reform UK voters and clear majority of Conservative voters thought it was right to leave, and the overwhelming number of Labour and Lib Dem voters thought wrong. Interestingly, almost exactly the same breakdown. But the really weird one, which I alluded to earlier today, was on what people wanted to happen now. 50% want us to join the single market as like a standalone arrangement. And you go, okay, well, that makes sense. There's a lot of talk about it. A lot of people trying to talk about that. We should join the single market, join the single market. But 55% want us to just rejoin the EU, which means, assuming everyone who took part in that poll considered their answers carefully, 5% of people support us joining the EU, but they're not all that sure about the single market on its own. Now, is that because they recognise that we need to be in the EU to decide the rules of the single market, and there's no point being in that market if we can't influence how it works? In which case I would say they're wrong, but interesting that fewer people see an advantage in joining only the single market as opposed to the full EU. Not a huge margin, but might suggest that maybe you're just as well or better campaigning just to join the EU. Don't muck about with stages like single market first. Unless, of course, President Macron of France's idea comes to fruition, but I've not really heard much about that for a while, whereby you've got like this outer tier of membership for the economic ties, but not the political ones, which sort of sounds like single market access to me. That might suit some people in Britain for a while. There's no serious appetite for diverging further from the EU, so leaving the ECHR remains a pipe dream. But it could be argued that the Tory press and lobby groups haven't really pushed that policy hard yet. There was no serious appetite for Brexit until the campaign began. But there we are, 5 years of Brexit, all crap. None of the supporters can point to a single way they've benefited. And no, sovereignty isn't an answer unless you can tell me how you've used this sovereignty to give you some form of autonomy that you did not have before. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video, please click the like button and subscribe for further content. If you'd like to support the channel further, you can click the join button for memberships. Thanks for watching. Until next time, I'll see you later.